Well, thank you, Amber, for that kind introduction, and I'm sure I speak for everybody in this room to encourage you to go and escalate. Because there's only so much calmness that I can do, and I think we need a bit of fire as well. So Amber, please do. As I arrived, actually, Amber asked what I was going to talk about, and I said, well, I'll just be ghastly about the government. And she said, well, I've done a bit of that already, but what I do want to do is say a few things about where we've got to in terms of Europe and the government's approach and the risks of the government's approach, but also about how we go forward, which is not a simple or straightforward matter. I think the first point to make really is that everybody in this room, if I've judged my audience correctly, can feel pretty vindicated about the debates that we had in 2016 as to whether Brexit was a good idea or not, and can feel pretty vindicated whatever position we took, and there were different positions within this room, I know, in terms of the debates in 2019, and in particular the risks that Boris Johnson was taking in the type of Brexit that he wanted to deliver. And most of you, I know, would have been present for John Major's magnificent speech a few weeks ago, but it is worth reiterating some of the key points that he made then, and remind ourselves of some of the arguments that we heard from the Brexiteers about how the UK would hold all the negotiating cards. And look how that has turned out not to be the case, that funnily enough the German car manufacturers are concerned about the integrity of the single market, rather than just prepared to demand that the German government does what they want because they want to sell us their cars. That the opportunities of leaving the European Union were pretty negligible, and here we are 6 years on, and Jacob Rees-Mogg is still desperately trawling Whitehall, putting out appeals in newspapers, asking for suggestions, and so far top of the list appears to be some measure that means we can change some of the signs in the Dartford Tunnel, even though it turned out that in fact we can make these changes anyway. But that seems to be the sum of where we've got to after 6 years. We were told that the economic consequences of leaving the European Union would be nothing to worry about, that we would have all the same advantages, of course, that we had as members of the EU, a complete failure to appreciate and understand the benefits that the UK achieved as members of the single market and members of the customs union, where of course we had a voice at the table. That has turned out to be completely untrue, the reassurances that we have received. And of course, if you look at what is now emerging, of course we've had complications because of COVID, but the evidence is becoming clearer that there's a significant hit to the UK economy, whether it is the 5% that some have argued that has already happened, or whether we are just on course to 4% that the OBR, the government's own forecaster, anticipates. They've seen no reason to change their assessment. Whether you argue that this has been sudden or whether it is a slow puncture, what there can be very, very little doubt is that this has come at a significant economic cost. And we are seeing the evidence in businesses no longer being able to trade. Our trade figures are down, interestingly, down not just with the EU but elsewhere as well. We are becoming a more insular, inward-looking, protectionist country, turning our back on the belief in free trade, a belief in bringing down trade barriers, a belief in the benefits of free exchange. This is a step back. This is the creation of trade barriers to the UK, which will have long-term damage to our prosperity. And if ever there was a particular interpretation of Brexit, a view of Brexit, the one that I think has taken the most damage is those who believe that somehow Brexit was going to result in Singapore on Thames. Quite the reverse. Partly because it's meant erecting trade barriers, as I've said, partly because the coalition of electoral support behind Brexit is one that is essentially going to be quite protectionist. It is a nationalist project. It is not a free trade, it is not a liberal project, it is a nationalist project that depends very heavily on nationalist voters. And it can come as no surprise that we're putting up tariffs on our steel, because that is what you need to do to maintain those votes. And it comes as no surprise that the pressure is to increase public spending. It is towards a larger state. Not every aspect of that I would condemn, but the idea that Brexit was going to lead to Singapore on Thames, I'm afraid, is for the birds. And then we've got the issue of Northern Ireland, as John Major so forcefully put it. An issue that was widely dismissed by Leave campaigners in 2016. As Amber well knows, it was widely dismissed by some members of the Cabinet in 2019. Theresa May refused to put up a border in the Irish Sea, and a lot of good it did her, because the ERG and the DUP were keen to see her removed. And instead, Boris Johnson, in order to get his deal done, in order to get Brexit done, was prepared to concede on this, was prepared to put up a barrier in the Irish Sea, and has now spent the rest of that time either denying what he had signed or trying to rewrite an agreement that he had signed. It was both disingenuous and irresponsible. Some of the rhetoric, I'm afraid, appears designed to fire up loyalist opinion in Northern Ireland, and we now end up in this ridiculous situation of the government coming forward with a fig leaf of a legal argument that it is not breaching international law, but I know of no reputable lawyer who thinks that that is correct. An argument that we need cross-community support for anything that affects Northern Ireland, even though Brexit certainly didn't have cross-community support, nor is it possible to imagine any arrangement, frankly, that would have cross-community support. And going against the views of the majority of members of the Northern Ireland Assembly who support the protocol, maybe not every detail, but broadly support the protocol. And also, remarkably, in circumstances where Northern Ireland is performing as an economy better than any regional nation of the United Kingdom, with the exception of London. As an approach, as an example of contempt for international law and indeed the rule of law, we are in the most extraordinary circumstances. I won't say unprecedented, because of course this is exactly what the government tried to do towards the end of 2020 with the internal market bill. But the fact that they are going back to the same point, attempting to rip up an agreement that was signed only a few years ago, is damaging for the rule of law, damaging for our international standing, damaging for peace and security in Northern Ireland, and potentially risks making matters much, much worse, because I don't think we should underestimate the anger that exists within the European Union. And should this Northern Ireland Protocol bill become legislation and be put in place and pursued and the powers used, then I'm afraid we will be in a very difficult retaliatory situation with the European Union, who will say, well, if you're not prepared to comply with what you have agreed to, then the tariff-free and quota-free access that you have to European markets will be at risk.
And that is a very dangerous situation for us at a time when the economy is already struggling, that the government may go further. The situation as we see it now is bad enough. The worry is that this government could make matters even worse. And the opportunity to sort of build up a stronger relationship is going to be put further and further into the future. So what do we do about it? Well, I applaud all of those of you who are still members of the Conservative Party and campaigning for a sensible approach. Some of you, I suspect, are more optimistic than I am about where that might go, but I wish you well in that particular task. I don't think we should pretend there are easy answers here, because you can sort of start off with, let's find some incremental improvements. And I think, by the way, that's a perfectly sensible approach. Is there a deal that we can do on sanitary and phytosanitary goods crossing the Irish Sea? Is there alignment that we can reach between the UK and the EU? Yes, there probably is something we can do there. Is there something we can do on mobility of labour? Yes, there probably is, to remove some of the inconveniences that have been created. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that such pragmatic, sensible reforms will be transformative to the economy. They won't bring that 4% of GDP back. But I think it's a worthwhile first step, and we would certainly support such moves. We would do better economically if we could go back into the single market and the customs union. And I personally don't have any problem in saying that. And Tobias Ellwood, for example, has made that argument, and I think good luck to him. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that such a sort of EFTA type arrangement is flawless, because we would fundamentally be a rule taker. And one can point to that arrangement and say, surely there's something better than just accepting rules. Isn't there something where perhaps we can have a say in what those rules might be? And that takes us to rejoining the European Union. I'll be honest with you, I hope that one day we do that. I do believe that our best interests would be as members of the European Union. There are some practical problems that we would have to get over. I am not sure that the British public are yet ready for that debate to be reopened. And I don't think the next general election, well, I think we know for sure that this next general election that the Labour Party won't be campaigning on that platform. I don't think even the Liberal Democrats will be campaigning on that platform, although I sometimes wonder why not. But ultimately, there's a huge amount to be said for it. For the interests of the British people, the big challenge, I think, is whether the European Union would see it in their interests. Particularly if you had a situation where opposition parties maybe supported it, and you had a powerful Conservative Party that opposed it, and their fear would be, well, we'll go through this process and we'll have endless negotiations, and you'll have the UK back in, and then a Conservative government will be re-elected, at which point the whole debate begins again. And I think there's a point here I would make. If we ever want to rejoin the European Union, and that is, I think, some way off, we are going to have to think about the fundamental alignment of our politics, and a two-party system in which one of those parties is essentially a Brexit party makes it very, very difficult for us ever to deliver the circumstances that we would need. Now that means either that the Conservative Party can be taken in a different direction, can cease to be a Brexit party, can recognise the error of its ways. It seems it might be quite close to recognising one of its big errors, sooner rather than later. Sooner, I hope. But whether it will recognise its other big error, I very much doubt. But good luck to you if you're able to transform the Conservative Party. If not, then I think we may be having to look at something more radical. But that's probably not for me in a Conservative Party event to be quite making that case as explicitly as I might do. But if we were in a world of electoral reform, of an opportunity for new parties to emerge, for opportunities perhaps for some of us to find a true home, then who knows, those circumstances may change. At that point, I think I should stop there, other than make this. The economic logic of a close relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union remains as strong as ever. If people were in doubts about it before, the evidence of the last few years has only demonstrated how necessary such a relationship is. And that in the end, the British public will recognise the direction that we need to go in, and somebody needs to provide the British public with that voice. Thank you very much.
So interesting, it's such a wide area you cover too. And I, for one, certainly share many of your views. And when you talk about people staying in the Conservative Party, unlike you, thinking that we can change it, I am reminded of the Labour MPs who stayed with Jeremy Corbyn. And some of them left, some of them formed a new party, and they are now out. And Keir Starmer, for which he gets some criticism, but he has nevertheless assumed the mantle. He's leading the Labour Party, and he held out until Jeremy Corbyn left so that he could lead the Labour Party, be part of the change. What do you think about the response, which I might give you, to your approach, which is waiting for the parties to change and to form new parties, perhaps with electoral reform? For those of us who think, I'm not supportive of this leader, but I'm still a Conservative, I can support the next leader.
Thank you. I think it's a perfectly justified approach. And look, possibly, had it not been for the accident of circumstances, I might have been someone who would take that view of waiting to see. And I'm not going to name names because it'll only cause them embarrassment or difficulty. But I look at some of my former colleagues who are holding the Prime Minister to account, who are making arguments, who are in Parliament representing sensible conservatism, and I am pleased that they are there. Yeah. And I certainly do not criticise those who took a slightly different path to the one that I took. I sort of set out my analysis. Some say, well, I fear that the Conservative Party cannot give up on its Brexit voters, because without its Brexit voters, it can't see now how it forms a majority or even a very large parliamentary party. And I think it's sort of fallen way behind amongst a different type of voter, the type of voter perhaps who I used to represent, who are looking elsewhere. But look, nobody knows for sure. You can also take the example of those who stayed in Labour under Michael Foot, including Tony Blair, and he went on to achieve one or two things himself. My fear is that the Conservative Party is now destined for a particular direction. But good luck to those who are sticking it out.
Thank you very much. And I do note that to reaffirm your position is that I think that a lot of the aspiring leaders to replace Boris Johnson are very much going to be reaching out to the Brexiteers first. Now we have questions from Charles, and then Keith, and then I'm going to ask Dominic if you would mind to give us your views perhaps. Thank you.
Amber, you kind of referred to it by talking about electoral reform. As a former Conservative 20 or 35 years, and I left the party voluntarily, partly because of Brexit, mainly because of Brexit, but also for other reasons. I've come to the conclusion, and this is sort of a bit of a Damascene conversion for me, that the only solution is to change the electoral system. We need to get away from the first past the post system. We need to have PR. We need to be actually more like a European country where everybody's vote counts in terms of securing representation in Westminster. And I'm just wondering, David, whether you kind of skated around it a little bit. You kind of alluded to, without using that PR word, do you also agree that the first past the post system has to go if we are able to rejoin the European Union?
Thank you. Then Keith, and then Dominic, and I'm going to ask David to reply.
Thanks. Keith Bates were MPs so many years ago that I served in the House with Dominic's father. I just want to endorse what Charles has just said, because I serve as the chair of the Conservative Action for Electoral Reform. You can see I specialise in unpopular causes, and I'd really be interested in your answer to that. But the question I wish to ask you is: you mentioned the rule of law. You're a former Lord Chancellor. We have a very distinguished former Attorney General here. Are you concerned that now the legal advice that is being given to the government is actually more politically motivated rather than legally motivated? And what are the consequences of that in terms of not only our reputation for upholding the rule of law, but actually the way it's going to be exercised in the future?
Thank you, Keith. Finally, Dominic, in your view, and then I'm going to ask David to answer.
Thank you. I find myself agreeing with much of what David has said, including, and I really do emphasise this, that I've never had any criticism of those of our colleagues who decided to take a different course of action in 2019. They are there and we're not, and they are in a good position to influence events, and we are fairly peripheral, even if we're quite outspoken. I do come back to this issue about whether it's proportional representation. I'm not sure whether that's the question. It's the extraordinary way in which the centre ground of UK politics has been squeezed out. And the Liberal Democrats do not, seems to me, despite their capacity to win by-elections, have any national traction beyond that whatsoever. And that does raise for me a big question about how we get the centre ground of politics going again. Of course, the ideal way would be to drag the Conservative Party back to the centre ground. But you yourself have raised the question that it doesn't look as if that's going to happen anytime soon. And I do think that reinforces the argument that proportional representation, which I've always opposed, certainly campaigned against the alternative vote system, which was offered by David Gauke, well, I know it's not PR. I must say my opinion has changed, because I think that without it, we are all going to be mired and being stuck in coalitions which appear at the moment to just suppress centrist thinking. I'd be grateful for your views.
No, very good. Well, on PR, I think there might be a bit of a consensus here. So I too am a long-term supporter of first past the post, who now thinks that we should move towards PR. And I make no sort of bones about this. There's always been an argument for first past the post, seemed to be about the strong constituency link. I think that's a good, legitimate argument. And there's always been an argument about PR, about, well, it's fairer in terms of reflecting how sort of people vote. And in the end, I'm a supporter of first past the post, because I thought, by and large, it gives us, no system is perfect, there are always trade-offs, but by and large, it gives us, good, clear government, strong, governments are able to govern, and a clear result, and you don't tend to get the sort of confusion that can come with coalitions. And I suppose there's a few factors in here. First of all, like Amber, like Dominic, like David earlier, I've got experience of a coalition government, a multi-party coalition government. All governments really are coalitions. And I can tell you the coalition of 2010, 2015 was darn sight more functional than the coalition of 2018 and 2019. And so I think I was partly persuaded by that, but also the point about the centre ground being squeezed. Now, if I'm not careful, I will launch into a detailed explanation of the yonder clock face, which I won't do, but essentially is a way of looking at the electorate and placing every part of the country on a clock face, to rather than a simple sort of left-right spectrum, because of course politics isn't just about economics anymore and economic security, it's also about cultural values. So once you play those two together Andrew Cooper, who many of you will know, has designed a clock face that demonstrates this. You can start to see how the parties have changed and how the electoral battleground has changed. And the problem with our politics at the moment is that the Conservative Party has moved in the direction of essentially populist or nationalist voters. People who once upon a time voted Labour because they voted Labour on the basis of economic class. But as the Labour Party, as with other centre-left parties, have become more culturally liberal, if you like, they've moved away from the cultural values of those voters. Those voters, first of all, felt homeless. Then they voted for populists like Nigel Farage, and then the Conservative Party, it sort of dawned on them that actually they should be voting for us. So the Conservative Party goes after those voters. At which point the Labour Party notices what's happened and thinks, well, we've got to go after those voters too. Leaving a whole subset of the electorates who are, if you like, sort of culturally moderate, moderately liberal, economically inclined towards free market, pro-business economics, and they feel somewhat homeless. And I don't see how those voters are going to be really at the centre of things under the first past the post system. You also have to remember that with first past the post, because sort of generally sort of liberal voters tend to be concentrated in cities, whereas more authoritarian voters tend to be spread out more efficiently across the country, there will be a natural bias towards the authoritarian voter rather than the liberal voter. And so I think we are likely to be stuck in this system for as long as we have first past the post. And I think PR, some form of PR, would deliver better, more responsible government. And if it's a multi-party government, then so be it, because, you know, frankly, we had a multi-party government between 2010 and 2015, and it's a done sight better than what has followed.
I agree with that. Thank you. One more round of questions. I think that, a few more rounds. Sorry, David, I think we've got a bit of time. John, the gentleman behind him, and then this gentleman.
David, you were writing the other day about a certain party leader who was somewhat distant from the truth, fact and fiction, who was a populist and who came unstuck in the end, and that was Tony Blair. And I just wonder if you can follow the route. Blair led to Miliband, who led to Corbyn, who led to disaster in his party. It may be that the same will happen in America with Trump and in Russia with Putin. But I'm more interested at the moment in what will happen if and when we get rid of the present incumbent, who also is a populist who doesn't know the difference between truth and fiction. And what will follow? And how long would it take before we get back into the centre ground?
Okay, what would follow? Very good question. This gentleman, and then this is my final round, unfortunately, because David has to leave us. Yes, 1, 2.
On the subject of industrial relations, we've seen government pay restraint largely at 2% with cases to go up to 3%. And yet, with the other hand, we've seen a increase in the basic state pension of 10%. This isn't being reflected to public sector workers, and it appears that the government's just going out for a fight with doctors, teachers, barristers, etc., which would make up quite a large proportion, these professions make up a large proportion of that sort of more metropolitan vote. Where do you think the government's going wrong? Should they come back to the table and negotiate further?
Very good question. Thank you. Final question.
Yeah, I've campaigned for years in Hampstead, and I know many of the people who are now MPs in the north because they came from our area. And recently we've been campaigning for a local election. We've had the main election, local election, we've had a by-election. And I can tell you that my colleagues who campaign, I've chosen not to campaign with them, but my colleagues who campaign are facing a lot of anger from people. And I'm not talking about members of the Conservative Party, I'm talking about people who vote Conservative. And you know, you talked, and Dominic mentioned the party moving back to the centre ground. Listen, if the party doesn't move back to the centre ground, it's going to get wiped out.
Yes.
I mean, that's what I think. And I think, you know, what can we do at grassroots level and local constituency level because there are arguments going on right down at the ground in constituencies about, oh, he's a Brexiteer, oh, he's like you, he likes Europe. And within our own group, we're actually identifying people. And there's a certain amount of rivalry between the people. What can we do at grassroots level? And how important is it? You know, I want to save the Conservative Party. I think the Conservative Party is important for our future of this country. We've always been a Conservative. We've lost our party, and we've got to get our party back on track into the centre ground, and I think it could win, but we've got to do that first. How do we do it? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I also, can I apologise, I didn't pick up Keith's question about the rule of law, and let me do that very quickly. Look, I'm really worried about where we've got to. I don't want to personalise this with Suella. I know her parents, and they're lovely people. But look, I mean, Dominic is better qualified than I am to talk about the role of the Attorney General. But it should be a figure where you are a lawyer first and a politician second. And you know, to espouse legal arguments that are so patently thin as to be non-existent, that attract widespread ridicule from the legal profession. You know, the lawyers are queuing up to turn into it, does nothing for the reputation of this country. And you know, I passionately believe that the rule of law is at the heart of what we should be about as a country, and I do believe it is being undermined by the approach. And you know, that I'm afraid reflects. You know, we can criticise the Attorney General, but ultimately I think this reflects the Prime Minister who appointed him, and that's where the blame should lie. If I may, I'll just pick up the strikes in public sector pay, and then bring the where next. Point. Yeah, I'm interested in this, partly having been Chief Secretary to the Treasury and having had a role there. It does seem to me, and I come at this as a fiscal hawk who is worried about the state of the public finances, and I don't buy all the arguments. Oh, there's a huge upsurge in tax receipts. That's in the short term. I think there are reasons to worry about where the public finances are. But even so, trying to impose essentially a real terms pay cuts of 7% or so, which is more or less what we're looking at, 6 or 7%, on the public sector at a time when the labour market is tight, is absolutely asking for trouble. And in the end, you have got to, we employ public servants to provide public services that are important. And we need to be able to recruit, retain, and motivate those public servants. And we've got to have a pay system that enables us to do that. And I worry that if we are too hardline on this, yes, of course we should be looking for modernisation. Yes, of course we should be looking for efficiencies. But trying to impose a pay cut specifically on that sector is, I think, really hard to do. I mean, we are all going to be a bit poorer as a consequence of this. I mean, we can't get away from that we are poorer than we thought we were. And there will be some pain, but that pain does have to be shared around. And I don't think it is reasonable to expect the public sector to have 3% pay increases when the private sector will probably be racing way ahead of that. Now, let's turn to the question of the future of the Conservative Party. Now, I am conscious, I have turned up and spoken at Conservative Party events for, and delivered speeches for, 25 years or so. Always with the intention of ending on an uplifting note as to why the Conservative Party's future is bright, and why, yes, we may just have lost in a landslide in 1997, but don't worry, the country will see sense and we will soon back in power, all of that. And I confess, worried about the future of the Conservative Party, because to come to John's point, who is going to be the next leader of the Conservative Party? Amber touched on this. There is going to be, if there is a vacancy soon, there is going to be a bidding war as to who can be the most determined on the Northern Ireland Protocol, who is going to take the toughest line with the European Union, who's going to really stick it
to those in Brussels and Paris and Berlin. And it's going to be like that because that's what the polling suggests Conservative Party members want. And that's why I worry that the future of the party is going to be really difficult. I hate to be wrong. I would love it if the Conservative Party was made up of the type of people in this room today, that you were sort of typical, that you were sort of really strong. And I worry that the party is a particular direction. If you look at how the party has declined in London, I cut my teeth in London in the neighbouring seat to Hampstead, did a lot of campaigning there. I fear that the home counties will be next, and we're starting to see signs of it. The seats that St Albans has gone, and I don't think we'll be getting that back. I still say we every now and again. But Guildford and Esher and Walton will go next, and I think there'll be plenty of others too. And I think the Conservative Party is changing, and I'm afraid that this is the sort of I feel somewhat rude to say this to an audience of Conservative Party members, but it's going to be a real uphill struggle. I mean, good luck to you, and work and maybe at some point after an election defeat, the view will come that if you want to get back into power, you've got to move back into the centre ground. That has happened before, but I think it's going to be quite a painful process, and there are strong institutional barriers or structural barriers to that happening, because that really isn't what the Conservative Party wants. And who will be the next leader? I don't know. I think it's quite open. I've written before that I think Liz Truss will be quite hard to beat. That's a prediction, not an endorsement. But if she doesn't win, I suspect it'll be someone with sort of singing similar tunes. And if the Conservatives get defeated at the next general election, I suspect the argument will be quite strong. Well, we didn't really believe it enough. We weren't true to the cause. That's where we may go. And David Frost MP. Oh, they say things can only get better. But maybe I'm wrong, and I hope you will all prove me wrong. Thank you very much.